we are good to go ahead and get started. Um, Thank you to everyone for coming today, the attendees and the speakers. We have an exciting kind of overview for you to talk through Oregon's Coastal Treasures, which is a story of rocky cliffs and tide pools. So firstly, I just wanted to introduce myself and Environment Oregon as the group that helped to organize and put this on. So my name is Ian John Carlo, and I am the Oceans Advocate with Environment Oregon. For those of you that are not Environment Oregon members or familiar to our group, we're a statewide grassroots environmental advocacy organization that really believes in a cleaner, greener Oregon, one that fights for nature and fights for special places where nature can thrive. And really, this webinar kind of exemplifies that. But rocky habitats, in a lot of ways, support that vision of a cleaner, greener Oregon. And we are all excited to be here today to tell you a little bit more about our rocky coast. So I just wanted to provide a very quick overview of Oregon's rocky coast and some of the management aspects of these areas, which Joe is going to dive in a little bit more into later. So these are just ballpark numbers, but Oregon's coast is roughly, or it's over 350 miles long, and around 40% of this could be classified as rocky habitat. And these areas are, as the name suggests, rocky. And they support a whole host of wildlife like seabirds, shorebirds, crabs, seals, anemones, sea stars, snails, and much, much more. We have some really exciting photos that we can show you in a little bit that kind of outline the amazing wildlife that these areas really support. And it's just really exciting. Specifically, these areas are managed through Oregon's Rocky Habitat Management Strategy, which is a really boring name, but it's a really awesome program. And it was created in the 1990s and updated recently, a couple years ago, to allow for 8 more community nominated sites, which you can see on the map. And importantly, this 2022 update also sort of changed the way that these areas are managed by putting them into 3 different categories. So there are marine gardens now, marine research areas, and marine conservation areas. So marine gardens focus on education, marine research areas really focus on scientific research, and marine conservation areas focus on conservation. So all have varying different levels of protection, and they, again, were updated in 2022. We'll have an option. I realized I didn't say this at the beginning, but I'm going to be doing an overview, and then we have a couple other speakers. And then at the end, there will be probably around 10 to 15 minutes for questions. If you have them, you should drop them in the chat at the end of the presentation. Okay, so for the other speakers today, we have Kelly Ennis, who is the director of Haystack Rock Awareness Program. And then we also have Joe Liebezeit from Bird Alliance of Oregon, who's the Assistant Director of Statewide Conservation. So with that, I think I will pass it over to Kelly to give a presentation on tide pools and a little bit more on Haystack Rock.
Great, thank you, Ian. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm very, very excited to talk to you all. So as Ian said, my name is Kelly Ennis, and I'm here representing the Haystack Rock Awareness Program, which is based in the city of Cannon Beach. In particular, we are focused around the marine garden of Haystack Rock. So I like to start a introduction with asking a simple question that I ask all of my staff and all of my students I have. And that's, who are you and why are you here? And that's something I want you all to think about for a second is, who are you? Sorry, do I know how to progress the slideshow? Thank you. I didn't know if I could do that. So I want you to really, really think about that question. You know, what brought you here? Why are you in this space? Why are you joining this webinar with us? And I'll tell you a little bit about who I am and who Haystack Rock Awareness Program is and why we are here. So just as a quick little kind of comic relief, this is one of my favorite XKCD comics, and I have this posted on my door for all of my staff to see before they go out on the beach to educate visitors. And what we do when we educate visitors is a technique called wildlife interpretation. So Haystack Rock Awareness Program, if you're from the North Coast or around the area, you might be familiar with us. We are the redcoats who go down to Haystack Rock at every single daylight low tide, and we answer questions to people. We talk to visitors, we tell stories, we share our passion and our love of this ecosystem in hopes to kind of create a sense of stewardship and ownership about these public lands. And because we go there every day, a lot of people kind of say that we're the experts or that we're the professionals, we're the teachers, and sometimes even the enforcers, because we'll talk a little bit about rules and regulations. But what we really are here to do is to facilitate education. My staff and volunteers, we come from all kinds of backgrounds, and we just want to show that everybody, anyone, no matter who they are, what their background is, whether it's in the sciences or not, they can be stewards of the environment. And having knowledge of a space, of a place, natural history about it, and the ecology of it, that leads to appreciation. And stewardship is really ultimately how we have healthy public lands that we can all share. If all people cared for the lands and respected all of our public lands and respected wildlife, then we wouldn't really need enforcement. And having people be the ones to be the stewards of the environment, every single person who visits that site caring about it, is more impactful and powerful than having officers who come in and cite violations after the fact, after damage has been done. And we just really believe here at Haystack Rock that every person can spread knowledge and create more stewards. So I'm going to dive in a little bit about what it is, how it is that we do that, before we kind of take a brief little virtual tour into the tide pools. All right.
You should be able to control the slides now. Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Are you able to
Yeah,
do
that little button. Okay, got it. Thank you. All right, so this is just a quick little brief history about Haystack Rock Awareness Program and our site in particular. We are a department of the city of Cannon Beach, but we have grassroots origins. And our history kind of starts in the 80s. A local couple, Neil and Karen Main, they were out at Haystack Rock looking at birds and tide pooling, and a lot of people kept coming by and asking like, hey, what are you doing out there? What are you looking at? What's in that scope, or what's that down there that you're looking at? And Karen, being a former school teacher, was really enthused to tell people answers, to teach them, to educate them. And it was such a positive thing that they were doing that felt really good about it, and realized that a lot of people were very curious. People who just came to the beach to enjoy the sand and the sights walked away learning a lot about the ecosystem because they were there. And they proposed to the city to make this a actual program. So they did a pilot program where Neil and Karen and a couple of their friends basically volunteered over the summertime during a few weekends to run a little education program at Haystack Rock. And it was so successful and positively received that the city adopted it as a formal program since 1985. And we have since grown to be a full department on our own. And now in the summertime, we are actually the largest department by personnel at the city of Cannon Beach. And so what we do is to promote learning and guide visitors in how to engage in sustainable tourism while still being able to feel like they can appreciate the site and that they were able to recreate and enjoy it all. And we do that by more than just traditional education. We don't go there with slides like this and presenting fact after fact. We engage in storytelling and in passion sharing, and we try to get to know the people that we're talking to so that we can help connect them to that site. And at the same time, we're also working in a very adaptable and dynamic environment. You know, day to day, it changes, hour to hour, the site changes, and we never know totally what we're going to get. So, since I only have a short amount of time with you to take you on this little virtual trip into the intertidal, I want to begin with a short little exercise to take you into the right mental zone. I know we're at a computer and everything, so use your imagination, but take a moment to pause and reflect. Think about what makes the tide pools, the rocky shores, and the intertidal special to you? What do you picture in your head when you think of a healthy, thriving intertidal ecosystem? Think about what animals do you see? What colors are there? What smells are in the air? What does it sound like to you? I want you to keep all of these senses active in your mind as we go in through this talk and as we keep exploring. Try to keep that in the background and really place yourself on that ocean shore. So for me, what I always tell people is the tide pools are a momentary doorway into the ocean, and there's no special tools required. You don't have to get a suit, a scuba suit, or anything. We can just walk right up to it. And we're invited into that home, into that doorway, not on our terms. We don't schedule it and say, I want to go to the tide pools at this time. The ocean tells us what time that we can go visit. And we are that. We are visitors. We are just visiting the site. And visitors into other homes should be respectful. We don't go to our buddy's house and raid their fridge until it's completely bare. And we don't act destructively. We don't walk around and on all their furniture, destroying everything. We try to be respectful. And when that door closes, when the ocean starts to close back up, and when we're leaving our friend's house, it shouldn't be obvious that we were there. It should have been left in a nice, clean, and safe space for everyone who lives there. So how do we accomplish doing that when it comes to the tide pools? And we do that usually by following some simple behavioral rules. These are often referred to as tide pool etiquette. I think everybody here has probably heard a lot of these because we're a pretty conservation-minded group here. At Haystack Rock, we like to call these the rules of the pools. And these are just basic behavioral asks that help maximize sustainability while exploring. And we've all kind of heard these guidelines, we've all seen signs with them, but I want you to look at this list and I want you to think about, what do you notice? It's a big list of do nots. It's a giant list of negatives. And just a moment ago, I asked you to take in your mind an image of a healthy ocean shore. What do you picture? What do you smell? What do you see? And it's probably a very calming picture. And I don't think in your image you had a bunch of signs that had large red circles with a slash through it saying, don't do this, don't do that, don't walk there, don't stand on that, don't touch that, don't. You probably didn't, because having that really just primes people's emotions for feeling defensive or feeling negative. It makes the environment seem a little less friendly, a little less inviting, a little less approachable. Again, it's the equivalent of going to your friend's house and they give you a list of all the things that you cannot do while you're there. And it just really primes people for having a negative interaction. So what we do at Haystack Rock Awareness Program is, this is what I call the stewardship edition of tide pool etiquette, which is, instead of telling people a bunch of do nots, don't do this, don't do that, we use a positive and educational spin that focuses on things that people can take away with them and to make them feel good about their interaction with the environment and to feel that they are doing things right while they've also learned something. So instead of telling people to do not stand on or climb on rocks, we let them know we explore by walking on the sand. This is a very healthy ecosystem that has a lot of biodiversity in it. And those animals and plants that live here, they maximize all the space and resources available to us. And I would be happy to show you around and show you what animals and plants do here. And I can show you what lives on, under, and around these rocks, and just exactly how these animals survive in these really unique environments, because what looks like just a rock is actually thousands of living animals on top of a rock, and you can't even really see any bare rock. When it comes to do not harass wildlife, I let people know that touching and handling tide pool wildlife can be appropriate and it can be a valuable tool in learning about biology, but we definitely want to do it in a way that doesn't harm the environment. So, for example, I let people know, let's touch and feel some of these different seaweeds that are under the water and notice the different textures of them. What do you think that tells you about their natural history, or what do those textures remind you of? What does it feel like? Whenever we teach kids how to pick up and handle hermit crabs, which is always a very popular thing, we let them know that when you're picking them up, you don't want to rise them really high into the air where they might accidentally fall, because that's the equivalent of a giant coming up to you, lifting you up over the Empire State Building, and oops, you've tumbled down back into that long, long distance. And that probably doesn't seem very fun. And likewise, we always tell the kids to make sure that they put all the animals back where they found them if they were handling them, because again, it's equivalent to a giant walking up to us. Say we're all in Oregon right now on the Oregon coast, picking you up, walking around with you a little bit, and then setting you down in eastern Idaho and saying, well, it's close enough. It kind of looks like you're home. I'm sure you'll be just fine. Telling stories like that tends to get kids a really good understanding about why we're behaving and why we're doing these sustainable practices. So all of these, there's different techniques. I don't want to spend too much time in giving you examples for each one, but I'm happy to answer any questions about how you approach these different do nots in different situations in a very positive way. Okay, so let's dive into a little bit of tide pool exploring. And again, you can keep your positive image in your mind. I really want you to engage your senses right now. And when we look at these pictures, think about the sounds that you're hearing, think about those smells, and really try to put yourself onto the rocky shores. So I always have 2 tips whenever we are exploring the intertidal. One question that is so fun to ask is, what do you see? Because oftentimes what begins as a rock, which is a lot of times the first thing that someone might say, turns into so much more once they actually do the 2 things that I ask, which is 1, take a closer look, and 2, be patient. So this picture here, what I love about it is, 1, we have people for scale for a little bit of height, and 2, you're able to really see our different tidal zonation zones. And you can see we have our lower intertidal, our mid, our high intertidal, and the splash zone, and a king gull, the most dominant species on the intertidal area, sitting there at the top. Okay, and so a common question that I will do whenever I have kids around, especially kids are always the most excited to learn, is to take them close into an area. So say this picture that we took of a low end tidal zone that was exposed, and ask them, how many animals do you see in this picture? Is there anything that makes you pause and think, is that an animal? Is that a plant? Or what exactly am I looking at? And I want the kids or whoever it is with me to take note of every single thing that makes them say, what is that? And then after that, what is that? Which is usually the first question. It's usually some follow-up questions about, how does it live? Our most popular one is always going to come back to the anemones, because anemones are a very common animal in our intertidal, but a lot of people don't recognize that they're animals. And you can find them all over the Oregon coast, and they are fascinating hunters. They have a crazy, unique biology to them. And even just talking about the color differences that we could get to them, why they have those colors, in addition to how they hunt. It's definitely a topic that I've unintentionally spent hours discussing with some of the kids at the tide pool. So yeah, in this picture, you can see our anemones. We have some sea stars. We have tunicates on there, and there's some red sponge. And if you look closely on the red sponge, you're even going to see a little Rostanga nudibranch sitting on it. All right, and so again, with the be patient, take a closer look. A lot of times what I tell visitors why we do that is, your eyes are going to adjust a little bit, and you're going to start seeing more and more and more little things that you didn't notice before. A lot of times they will look at a rock, and we're talking about the anemones, one of my favorite topics, and they will be staring for a while, and you're going to start seeing more and more unique things about them, or you're going to start seeing the tiny little details around on them. So on the left here, I love this picture because we have highlighting here some aggregating anemones that are in the process of splitting right now. So anemones reproduce sexually like many animals. but they are also capable of reproducing asexually by essentially cloning themselves and splitting in two by fission. So you actually see a couple different anemones on the screen doing that right now. And these anemones are very territorial and aggressive against other enemies that are not their clones and planting next to them. So they will use their stinging cells, their nematocytes, to prevent other enemies, essentially using them as a physical barb to block other enemies from planting next to each other. And we call these the clone wars. So where you see this nice little band of bare rock between these two sets of enemies lets you know that those are different clonal colonies next to each other. And then this middle picture, I have a couple of chitons that were found next to this green anemone. And again, part of the look closer thing is this rock is also speckled in a bunch of new barnacle implants. Every tiny little dot, this picture's a little blown up, but every tiny little dot you see on there, that's not sand, that's all young juvenile barnacles that have just freshly implanted. And on the right, I'm showing you a picture of a lined shore crab, which is often found in our mussel beds. And you only going to really see them in the daytime if you're taking your time to actually explore and look a little closer. And so while you're looking across and scanning across the mussel beds, you might see a shore crab kind of popping in and out or scurrying a little way. But that's the kind of thing that if people are rushing through and just moving very quickly and not really taking their time exploring, you could really easily miss. In the mussel beds, you'll also see a lot of granular crabs that will be living among there. And let me just tell you, if you have kids, they're gonna want to try to find some crabs. Okay, so we will keep exploring a little deeper and look at some more of these beautiful, vibrant colors. On the left here is a really fun find. We are zoomed in super close to a ochre sea star that is actively eating and hunting this mussel. So you can see a bunch of little tube feet on the underside. So we're looking at the underside of this ochre star that has wrapped itself around this mussel and is using its tube feet to pry it up a little bit. And that glob that you see there is the stomach. So they put their stomachs outside their body and release digestive enzymes to digest the mussel on the outside, and then they will eventually pull that stomach and all those contents of its, all those delicious mussel contents back inside of itself. And I probably accidentally said it a few times already in this talk. Maybe you hear sometimes some locals say the phrase just an anemone, or I'll sometimes catch my staff and volunteers saying things like, oh, there's not a lot out right now. We just have some anemones. And this is what is just an anemone. All these beautiful, vibrant colors that when you really take the time to look at, you start seeing more and more details about it. It's incredibly striking how vibrant these animals are, and nothing in our intertidal is dull. Nothing is boring. Nothing is just a hermit crab, just an anemone, just a rock. There is always some kind of action going on. I like to call it our live National Geographic that you get to explore out here. We may have not gotten all the nice editing of putting things down really quickly, and it takes a few hours, but that's part of the fun of discovery. And I would be missed to not go on an intertidal journey and not show you some nudibranchs, a very popular find for a lot of people. There are definitely a large group of individuals out there who will come to the tide pool specifically trying to look for different nudibranchs because there's so many species out there and they are all very unique in their morphology in particular. And they are definitely harder to find. Some visitors, they've looked at a lot of pictures online and not realized just how zoomed in we are. If you look at all these tiny grains of sand on the screen, that lets you know a little bit of how much of a macro lens we are using to blow these animals up to really bring it close to you. So we already did the work and found these nudibranchs for you over the last few weeks. We have on the left here is what we call a thickhorn. It's probably the most common one that you will find here on the at Haystack Rock Marine Garden. And they are, again, a fascinating species to talk about because I get to tie them into my favorite of talking about the anemones and how these animals have these beautiful serrata on their back that look kind of like little tentacles. So these guys are able to eat the tentacles of anemones, which hold the stinging cells and nematocytes in them. And instead of just digesting those nematocytes, these nudibranchs will actually recycle them and reuse them, and they will put them into their serrata at the tips there as a way to ward off other predators that might want to have a delicious little slug snack. In the middle here, we have a leopard, and then on the right is one that we like to call a clown nudibranch. And here, a couple other nudibranchs. We have on the left an alabaster. And what I really want to share here is just about the incredible diversity and how we are making new discoveries all the time. So on the right here, we found this nudibranch about 2 weeks ago now. And it was really striking to us because we were not able to ID it. And we thought it kind of looks like a Hopkins rose, which we occasionally see at Haystack Rock, but it's not, the morphology isn't quite right. It's a little hard to see in this picture, some of the full body details that we were looking for. But after spending a good hour just taking photos and looking at it all over the place, we realized we were seeing a species that none of us had seen at Haystack Rock before, including our veteran who had been with us for over 22 years now. We had not seen the species. And I actually had to email out someone from Santa Cruz who had published a paper about the species in 1998, and it was the only one that I could find. So it was called a cumulus. I don't remember the full scientific name. Sorry, I can look that up if you're curious. And just for giving you a scale, this is about 1/2 centimeter. So we explored a tide pool close enough to find a 1/2 centimeter long nudibranch that none of us had ever seen on our site before. And that's one of the beauties of keeping these places healthy, having an educational group to guide people and teach them how to do this so they can go explore safely on their own, is we're going to be making discoveries and we're going to be seeing range changes. We're going to be seeing evolution of the wildlife and the animals in new discoveries that people aren't making because scientists can't go out and comb through these sites all the time. They can't catalog these. We need people who are passionate and people who are respectful of the environment to do that, because who knows what we're missing out there. Okay. All right, and here is my other little positive send-off, is this is something really promising for the future. This is an image of a juvenile sunflower star that we found at Haystack Rock. And it's so heartwarming and a huge relief because this is just promise for the future. For those who don't know, 98% of the sunflower population had drastically died off due to sea star wasting syndrome. And we personally at Haystack Rock Awareness Program had not seen a sunflower star at Haystack Rock for over 10 years. And then we saw them again last year. And it just goes to show that when you are protecting a space and you are respectful of it, that we can help this place grow and thrive for generations and generations to come as it exists in flux, as it changes and evolves. If we learn to change and evolve with it and learn about it, we share the knowledge about it with everyone else and with each other, we can really protect this place, as it will last. It should outlast all of us. And that's just my positive send up I want to send you. I hope the weight of how huge that return is comes on all of you, because it's been always a lot of sadness in modern time about our ocean ecosystem. We have threats from human sources and threats from development, threats from different industry, and from climate change, but there is a lot of positive out there. So every little bit of stewardship really does make a difference, and that's how we're going to really make some real world impact on these sites. I didn't want to take too much time looking at the intertitle, but go ahead and for the question sections, let me know if you have any additional questions about intertitle or our program, or about our interacting with the public, how to make something a little positive, how to share knowledge in a way that is going to help engage people with the site a little more, how to create stewards, anything on those topics. I would love to talk a little bit more, but we're gonna stop looking down and gonna go ahead and look up and let Joe take it from here.
Thanks, Kelly. Joe, I will put you at the spotlight on.
Hey, well, thanks everybody, and thanks Kelly for that amazing presentation. That was really great, and I'm sure I'll be touching on some of your points in my presentation as well. Let me see if I can advance the slide here. There we go, perfect. So I will be, in my talk, I'll be focusing a lot on the birds. And again, my name is Joe Liebezeit, Assistant Director of Statewide Conservation with Bird Alliance of Oregon, formerly Portland Audubon. And so I'll be talking a lot about the birds, but first giving you some background on the organization, a little bit more background on Rocky Habitats, and at the very end, talking a little bit about more what you can do in terms of advocacy to help protect these amazing places and create that stewardship in a place like Cannon Beach that Haystack Rock has done an amazing job. So this is a picture of Ecola Point, which is a new marine conservation area just designated a couple of years ago, and just north of Cannon Beach. So just to give you a little bit of background on Bird Alliance of Oregon. Originally we were called Oregon Audubon Society, and then Portland Audubon, and now Bird Alliance of Oregon. We've been around a long time, maybe that's why we had so many names. We've been around since 1902, one of the oldest conservation organizations in Oregon. We helped back in the day with our first president, William Finley, and his compatriot, Herman Bowman. They did a lot of exploration around Oregon, including on the coast. And this picture here, you can see on the right, is of them in about 1903 or something, scaling up Three Arch Rock. So they did an expedition out there without any ropes or anything, in a rowboat. They rowed out there, stayed a few days, and took photographs with that. You can see in, I think, Herman Bowman's side, that box, and then it looks like William Finley is carrying the, I think I got them switched. I think it's William Finley carrying the camera, and then Herman Bowman carrying the tripod to get pictures of these murres up there. So we wouldn't do that today. We wouldn't cause that kind of disturbance and trampling. But back then they did it, and they lobbied to the Teddy Roosevelt administration at the time, and got this Three Arch Rock to be at the time the first wildlife sanctuary or wildlife refuge on the West Coast for birds. And it eventually became the U.S. Fish and Wildlife's National Wildlife Refuge that we have out there now, which spans the whole coast. So that's one of our first actions as an organization that we did way back when. Since then, we've done a lot of work with the marbled murrelet, which you can see in this picture on the left, a bird that nests in old growth and mature forests and forages out at sea, a very unique bird. Could do a whole presentation on that, but won't today. We just mentioned that we've done a lot of work on that bird, including helping it get listed as endangered, both at the federal and state level. We were one of the groups that helped establish the marine reserves back in 2012, about 12 years ago. We've done a bunch of work to protect forage fish, which are those small fish like herring and anchovies and species like that, that they're a very important prey for seabirds. So that's been a focus of some of our work in recent years. And then finally, rocky habitat protection, which is our focus today. So go ahead and do the next slide here. So Ian mentioned the 8 new sites, and I wish I could say more about it. There's a lot to say. Don't have a lot of time today, but just want to say that there were many groups on the coast, many members of the public that spent years really working on this issue. First, working to try to get very conservation-friendly policies put into the updated management strategy, which, as Ian mentioned, was finalized in 2022. And then a number of different groups along the coast nominated new sites for protection. So there are 8 new sites, as Ian mentioned. Haystack Rock is an existing site and has a lot of support around it, as you heard from Kelly. These new sites are new and they don't have a lot of support at this point, or they have varying levels of support. And so one of our big objectives in the years to come is to really try to get stewardship efforts like there is at Haystack Rock at some of these sites. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but you can see the sites here. There'll be time for questions later on, and I'm happy to answer those. And unfortunately, can't dig into them too much in this brief talk today. They are some of the most iconic places in Oregon. For example, Coquille Point, which is on the south coast, just adjacent to the city of Bandon, is a new marine garden, just like Haystack Rock is. And so there's a group there called Shoreline Education for Awareness that is working to ramp up their efforts to try to do the outreach and similar work to what ATRAP is doing at Cannon Beach at this site. So before I talk more about the birds, I just want to just stress a few things that are also really important to recognize about our rocky habitats on the Oregon coast, is that they're, you know, as Kelly mentioned before, people from all over the state and from all over the world really flock to the Oregon coast, especially in the spring and summertime, to really enjoy the natural beauty of these places and the amazing life in their intertidal pools. And so it's a really important part of Oregon's tourism industry on the coast. And we, back, I think the estimate in 2022 was there's over $2 billion when you factor in all the hotel stays and all that, just on the Oregon coast that was generated that year. So this is a big attraction for people and tourists. And so we want to make sure that these places are enjoyed, but in a respectful way, as Kelly spent a lot of time on in her presentation. These sites are also really important for fish and for fisheries, which is something we're not going to focus on today, but just want to throw that out there and say that in particular rockfish, which are very important commercially. There are some commercial fisheries on different species of rockfish in Oregon that a lot of the juvenile rockfish utilize not the intertidal zone as much. They do when there's high tide, but they also utilize these subtidal rocky habitats just offshore from the intertidal habitats for rearing, for nursing before they become larger fish and move further out into the water. So just want to recognize that really important for fish and our commercial and recreational fisheries as well. So with that, I'll jump into talking, giving a kind of a little slice of the bird life in our rocky habitats and rocky shorelines. And so at any given time of the year, you can go out and see witness a different part of the life cycle of many different bird species. If you go in the spring, if you're out there in April, you'll see a lot of loons, like this red-throated loon in the lower left photo, a bird that will not nest in the Oregon's rocky habitats. They're actually on their way to nesting on the tundra and in the Alaskan Arctic, in the Canadian Arctic. They're a really amazing bird. But during the springtime, when they're migrating up from their more southerly wintering grounds, they're utilizing those subtidal habitats right off of our rocky zone in Oregon, and you'll see them sometimes in the hundreds. And if you take your time and are patient, just like Kelly mentioned, you need to be sometimes with intertidal life, you can see just hundreds and hundreds of loons and other really cool birds migrating up along the coast in the spring. These rocky habitats are also a really important place for nesting seabirds like these pigeon guillemots, and I'll talk more about that in the next slide here. So several years ago, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife did an estimate. They do these aerial surveys with planes and helicopters up and down the coast every year, and they estimated the number of colonial nesting birds, or birds that tend to nest in those big clusters, along the Oregon coast. And as you can see, the total, this is from 2007, it's about 1.3 million birds, seabirds, that nest on our coast and on the islands off of our coast. And this is a really high number. When you factor along the whole entire west coast, lower contiguous west coast, Washington, California, and Oregon, Oregon has more than half of the nesting seabirds. And so it's a really important place for them. So if we have impacts on these birds on our coastline during especially the very important nesting period, we're going to have major concerns about their population trajectories. So just to show you a couple of different species here, the common murre, over 600,000 common murres are known to nest on the Oregon coastline in different places. And then on the right side here, you can see the 3 different species of cormorants that we have: double-crested cormorants, Brandt's cormorants, pelagic cormorants, gulls. Kelly showed that picture of a gull on top of that rock at Haystack Rock before, and then birds like the rhinoceros auklet. So you can see the numbers here. I'm going to pick a couple other birds to focus in on in more detail in the next few slides. I also want to mention the marbled murrelet, which you can see in the green at the bottom of the table. They're not a colonial nesting bird, but that's their population estimate in Oregon from a recent survey, about 10,000 birds. They're, again, as I mentioned before, a species that's listed as endangered and as threatened both federally and endangered at the state level. So the common murre, just talked about them a little bit. Again, their population estimate in Oregon is over 500,000 birds that nest here. In some years at Yaquina Head, just on that colony alone, you can see 80,000 birds. In more recent years, they've been having, I think this year was a down year for them. They had lower nest survivorship. Part of that is due to bald eagle numbers, which have increased, have created some problems for some seabirds nesting on the coast, but it's all part of our natural ecosystem. Bald eagles were down in number for a while. They're back up because of our control of DDT. Right now, the common murre is of moderate conservation concern. Their numbers seem to be stabilizing on the west coast. And one little fun fact I want to point out is you can see this photo of their eggs. A lot of seabirds have really pointy eggs, and that's because they nest on these really steep cliffs. And so if they tend to move around, they spin in a circle and they won't fall off the cliff. Tufted puffin, this is an iconic bird in Oregon, particularly at Haystack Rock. And Kelly could have talked about that, but her gaze was directed downwards at the amazing intertidal life. But tufted puffins are actually in a lot of trouble right now in Oregon. Their numbers have plummeted from back in the 1980s to 5,000 birds to the most recent estimate is 553 back in 2021. I think there was an estimate done this year, but the numbers are not quite out there yet. But there's a lot of concern about the species. We don't know exactly why it's declining. There's a lot of thought of maybe climate change impacting their forage prey, a number of things, a number of other issues, which I'll touch on some other threats to seabirds later on. In any case, I know that National Audubon has a new employee. Her name's Catherine Lucier, and she's working on trying to work and develop a plan around trying to help this bird, particularly down in Washington and Oregon and California, where their numbers are really declining. They are a burrow nester, so they need rocky habitats, but they need the grassy part on top of the rocky habitat where they can burrow into the thin layer of earth there to make their underground nests. And here's a bird that is it's the second most common nester off the Oregon coast, the Leach's storm petrel, but you may not see them a lot because they are nocturnal for one. They are a burrow nester like the tufted puffin, and their populations are mostly on the south coast on some of those offshore islands. But their population is almost 500,000 birds in Oregon, to the best of our knowledge. They are a species of that is declining globally. It's a pretty drastic decline, 30% decline globally. So it's a species of concern for sure. But if you do a pelagic birding trip and you go out and you're lucky enough, you might be able to see them out there in the water, and they kind of putter their legs on the water as they forage, and they forage on plankton and small fish at the surface of the water. Brown pelican is an iconic bird of our West Coast. They were removed from the endangered species list back in 2009. They have recovered in a lot of ways from the early DDT that was impacting their productivity for making those thin eggs that were crushed by the adults as they tried to incubate them back in the day. But after the ban of DDT, they have come back. They are still a species of concern, and there are sometimes some years, in recent years, we've seen that their nesting mortality can be really high, and it's thought to be connected to the fluctuations in some of their prey. They eat a lot of anchovies and sardines, and so when those fish have very cyclical population booms and busts, some of it is affected by overfishing, and they breed down in Southern California and Baja, and islands off Baja, Mexico, but they do make their way up to Oregon, as you all know. So I focus a lot on seabirds, but the other bird life off of our rocky habitats, there are other birds and waterfowl too. So if you've been to Haystack Rock or other places on the Oregon coast, you may have seen the harlequin duck. It can be sometimes easy to overlook, but if you get a really good look at them, they're really beautiful, amazing birds, as you can see in this picture here. Other waterfowl that you might see are the scoters, the black sea ducks, the surf black scoter, and white-winged scoters, which you don't have a picture of, but I think a lot of you in the call have probably seen them. And also shorebirds. The black oyster catcher, which you see here, is a shorebird. They're not a seabird. They're actually more closely related to things like plovers and sandpipers. But they are a rocky shore specialist, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in another couple slides. And I want to finish up pretty soon here because I want to leave time for questions. So I'm going to go kind of fast these last few slides here. So I just want to touch again on what Kelly touched towards the end of her talk, a little bit about the threats to our environment that we need to be cognizant of and try to do something about. So as you saw in some of my earlier slides, some of these seabirds are experiencing these population declines. And there's some recent papers that have come out in recent years saying, you know, we've seen a 70% decline in seabirds across the world from 1950 to 2010. That's pretty alarming. That's that graph you can see here on the right side. And also, you know, over 25%, a quarter of all seabird species are threatened globally. So there's definitely reason to be concerned. Some of those threats are from climate change. And as a lot of you here living in Oregon may have heard on the news, the warm blob, which is basically surface temperatures on the ocean, the North Pacific, have been increasing in some years more than normal. And that has thought to affected things like where the forage fish are. Forage fish do not like that warm water, will swim away, and then the birds that feed on them have to go further, and sometimes they can't find enough food and their young die, and you have these many seabirds washing up that are dead, and so that's a concern. Ocean acidification is related to climate change. That's basically the more carbon dioxide we put in the air eventually gets incorporated into the ocean, and it lowers the pH of the ocean, causes it to be more acidic. It can affect things like how animals like shellfish can get the shell, the calcium carbonate, onto their bodies. And so if they can't produce that, they don't survive well, and then birds don't have those them to eat. So all these things can stress our rocky intertidal habitats. Of course, plastic pollution and overfishing are other things too that impact our seabirds. So Kelly talked a lot about this before, and I really liked your messaging on positive reinforcement to visitors to the coast. But some of the threats that we have are things we can really do about, and it's great to hear at Haystack Rock the things they are doing about it in a very positive messaging way through their stewardship work. But of course, trampling of our habitats. A lot of people don't mean to do this, but when you do it, you can crush some of those amazing, beautiful intertidal creatures that Kelly showed us. Unleashed dogs are another issue. They'll chase birds, and they might not kill the birds, but when you do that repeatedly, it can really stress the birds out and cause them to have a lower nesting success. Drones are another issue. Birds perceive those as other predators and will chase them and stress them out, and can really have a big negative effect on them. So we, again, need to do that positive messaging to the public that visit these sites that in most cases don't want to cause any harm, and just say, hey, this is a way you can recreate responsibly in these amazing areas. And to talk very briefly about our Black Oyster Catcher project, we've had it going since 2015. It's been almost 10 years now. we employ community scientists to help us do this work. Without volunteers helping us monitor these birds, we couldn't learn more about this bird and help protect them better. So as I mentioned before, they depend very much entirely on rocky shoreline habitat. They forage in the rocky intertidal zone. They nest just above that in the rocky habitat above the tide line. They're species of conservation concern. They're not listed as endangered, but they are in the Oregon strategy species list. And they're a great species for people to connect with. You don't have to be a birder to monitor these. They're really conspicuous. They're big black shorebirds with that orange beak. Again, community science, we rely on volunteers up and down the coast to message about these birds and to carry out this temporary signage we have about nesting birds and what you should do to minimize your impacts. And without having the boots on the ground like the HRAP folks have, and like we have in places around the coast, you couldn't really connect in an effective way with the public to get that messaging out. So again, I want to just emphasize what Kelly dug into more before about that. So in terms of the science, we've been doing abundance surveys of this bird. We did a number of abundance surveys from 2015 to 2019, and then we've done nest monitoring. So that's can be kind of tedious. We have our volunteers go out and find nests of these birds, then go out there regularly and see if the nests hatch or if they don't hatch and why are they successful or not, which, as you can imagine, is a really important part of their natural history. And so what we found from some of this work so far is the population of black oyster catchers in Oregon is pretty small. It's less than 1,000 birds, about 500 to 600 birds in Oregon. Population does seem to be small, does seem to be stable, even though it's small, and we have higher densities of them on the south coast. And then a more recent publication we're working on with our collaborators from California, where we pooled oyster catcher data from Oregon and from California into looking at a big region-wide analysis. There's a lot to say here, but I'll just say one thing we did find in this graph here is that the productivity in Oregon does seem to be higher than further south. And that dotted line you can see on the graph is the line at where productivity has to exceed. When you're above that line, it's good. The population growth can be positive. If you're below that line, it means you're not producing enough chicks and the population declines. So there's concern that in the southern part of the range, that the black oyster catcher population could be vulnerable to decline. We might not be seeing declines there because maybe some of the Oregon birds are a source population that's migrating down and filling in some of those niches down in the California area where the birds are having a harder time. So pretty much done here, but just want to wrap up and say there's a number of ways you can protect rocky habitats. You can visit the sites and support the coastal economy. You can visit Haystack Rock, learn from the redcoats with HRAP and other groups about the amazing wildlife and intertidal life. You can become a community science. You can become an oyster catcher volunteer. Another thing you can do is advocate. And right now we're working on a bill that would add a lot more capacity to the agencies that administer these sites so that they can manage these sites in a more effective way. So I'm sorry I didn't leave a lot of time. It looks like we have about 5 minutes, but I'll pass it back to you, Ian, and we can have some Q&A if there's time.
Thanks, Joe. This was the last slide that we had, so we're just going to hang out on the screen, but we do have a couple of questions. If folks have more, please drop them in the chat or use the Q&A feature. So I'm just going to go through kind of rapid fire here because we do have about 5 minutes left. So the first one, just going through the webinar chat, is do you have suggestions for a simple resource for recognizing different bird species specifically in Oregon? And then if you do, Joe, do you have those as like slides as a resource?
Well, there are a lot of different resources. I mean, field guides, both, field guides on your phone and that you can buy as a hard copy. The Sibley Guide's a great guide. Is that what the person was getting at? I think that's one resource. The numbers of seabirds that you saw that I showed on that one slide earlier on were from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, the Seabird Catalog. It's a publication. So I'm happy to be connected with the folks that had those questions and provide other resources.
Okay, awesome. Another question we have is, how do you suggest that you approach visitors to marine gardens to catch their interest? I'm assuming that means, how do you get people interested in marine gardens? I think is what that means. So Kelly or Joe, if you want to answer that.
Yeah, if we're talking about like just visitors, how to kind of engage them, or someone that you see, I do a lot of overhearing, and I'm a volunteer and want to engage. Okay, so yeah, while you're like if you're wearing volunteer gear that kind of labels yourself, that's a little different. I think the best thing is to approach people and give a brief introduction. I just always let them know my go-to phrase is always, "Hi, how are you doing? Welcome to the area. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. If I actively see them looking at something, then I will engage them on that particular item, or if they seem like they're ready to open it up a little bit, I ask them about them. I ask them where they're from, because then that can kind of segue a little bit into some way that you can make a personal connection with them.
Probably just have time for a couple more here, so I have some queued. One is related to sea stars, and I think it's that there are problems like with sunflower sea stars, for example. So how are other populations doing in Oregon?
Yeah, I can't speak for all the sites, but we do monthly surveys on our sea stars here, and what we've seen is there is generally more resilience in the population to sea star wasting syndrome. We still see deaths and signs of sea star wasting syndrome, but it's less severe, and it seems to have less death associated with it than we had in the past. That doesn't mean that an event can't happen again or that other sites aren't experiencing events, but for us, we are seeing in general recovery, but recovery takes a long time because they're long-lived species.
Great. One more question we have here is, I think for Joe, but do we have estimates of seabird populations prior to like really established settlements along the coast? And is there evidence of population declines from earlier times, like from then to like 1960 or something?
That's a really good question. I don't know about the historic surveys. I mean, I know Fish and Wildlife has been doing them for few decades, but I don't know prior to the 80s what has been done. So that I can ask the biologist at the Fish and Wildlife, the Coastal Fish and Wildlife Refuge, Sean Stevenson, and see if he knows if there's like more historic information on seabird numbers on our coast. I think it's one of those things often when, you know, even 50 years ago, there just wasn't as much attention or much resources to do that kind of stuff at a scale of the whole coast. But I can see what I can find out.
Awesome. Thanks, Joe. Well, I think we're pretty much at time, so I think we are going to wrap up here. First off, I just wanted to thank you all for coming, and thank you to Joe and Kelly for helping inform us all about tide pools and seabirds and Oregon's rocky habitat. I'll say I'll be sending a follow-up email in the coming days to all the attendees that will probably have contact information for Kelly and Joe. If you have other questions, you should feel free to reach out to them or myself, and we can hopefully get you some answers. But again, thank you all for coming, and thanks again for just hanging out with us. And then I'm going to stop it now. So thanks, everybody.